Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Teaching English webinar for teacher educators. This month, we are exploring multilingual pedagogy, teacher leadership, and collaborative professional development in multilingual contexts. My name is Shirin Soyuz, and I'll be your host today. Thank you very much for joining us for this live session. While we are waiting to get started, please introduce yourself in the Q&A. Tell us where you are joining from. If you work in pre-service teacher education, type pre-service. If you work in in-service teacher education, please type in-service in the Q&A. You will have the opportunity to ask questions during the session. Please use the Q&A to ask your questions. We'll use the chat for announcements. The link to the certificate will be provided in the thank you email that you'll receive in a few days. Finally, this session is being recorded and the webinar recording will be available on our Teaching English website in the next couple of days. So let me introduce our guests for today. Dr. Melike Bulut is a senior lecturer in TESOL and teacher education at Sheffield Hallam University. Her research and professional interests include language teacher education, teacher learning, teacher research, and multilingual education. And Dr. Thi Phuong Dung Cao is a lecturer in the Faculty of English Linguistics and Literature at Vietnam National University. Her research interests include multilingualism, vocabulary learning and teaching, corpus linguistics, and English language teaching. And Dr. Tae-Hee is Associate Professor of Education and Director of Internationalization at the University of Southampton. Her research focuses on multilingual education, language policy, teacher development, educational change with a particular attention to equity and inclusion. And Dr. Prem Prasad Poudel is an assistant professor at Tribhuvan University. His research focuses on language policy, multilingualism, language revitalization, and teacher education. So we are looking forward to hearing about your research and experiences from your project. So I'd like to invite, first of all, Dr. Melike Bulut and Dr. Thi Phuong Dung Cao to start today's session.
Thanks for the introductions, Shirin. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Melike Bulut and I'm a senior lecturer at Sheffield Hallam University. Together with colleagues from Sheffield Hallam University and Vietnam National University, we've been exploring one question that perhaps many teachers around the world face. How can we better support teachers working with multilingual learners? Although our project took place in rural Vietnam, we believe many of the lessons are relevant for beyond this context. Let me begin with why we started this project. Across many countries, research consistently shows that recognizing and drawing on students' home languages support learning and inclusion. Yet teachers often tell us they haven't received enough training or preparation for teaching multilingual learners. In Vietnam, this challenge is particularly visible in rural, mountainous areas where many children speak ethnic minority languages at home but are educated mainly through Kin, the majority Vietnamese language and the official language. This creates significant challenges, not because multilingualism is a problem, but because teachers haven't been adequately supported to work in such multilingual, linguistically diverse classrooms. We are aware that this situation will sound familiar to many educators internationally, not only in Vietnam. Before talking about the project, it is worth, I think, explaining what we mean by multilingualism. For us, multilingualism simply means that learners draw on more than one language in their everyday lives. Rather than viewing those languages as obstacles, as barriers to learning, we see them as resources for learning. When students can connect new knowledge to the languages that they already know, to the languages that they speak at home, the lessons, our classrooms become more inclusive, participation increases, and learners feel that their identities are recognized and valued in the classroom. This perspective aligns with current thinking in multilingual education literature, which encourages teachers to build on learners' full linguistic repertoires rather than separating languages rigidly. With this conceptual framework and this context in mind, our project focused on two questions. First, what kinds of professional learning do primary teachers in multilingual settings actually need? And the second, can teacher-led professional development, and in our project, this was teacher activity groups or tags, as we call hereafter, help teachers develop multilingual teaching practices? We were especially interested in the role English language teachers could play as leaders of this learning process because of their expertise in language learning and language teaching. With the support and contributions of local teacher educators in Vietnam, we developed the Agents of Multilingualism training and also the teacher activity group resource book that you can download freely from British Council website. We began by training 15 English language teachers. The training involved two parts. The first part was about multilingualism in education, and the second part was about how to facilitate teacher activity groups. The important point is that these teachers were not simply just attending another workshop or seminar. They were being prepared actively to become leaders, facilitators of tags in their own schools. They were provided the teacher activity group resource book that you see on the screen to guide their engagements with colleagues when they are back to their schools. So let's look at the content of these tags. Each English teacher then led a teacher activity group involving colleagues from other subjects groups in their own schools over an 8-week period. And they met fortnightly 4 times, and they covered these materials, these concepts throughout these weeks. In tag 1, for example, teachers explored the diverse language backgrounds of their students and considered how these linguistic resources impact classroom engagement and learning outcomes. Then in Tag 2, the session focused on examining personal and institutional beliefs about language and how these beliefs influence their teaching practices. Going forward in Tag 3, introduced practical strategies for integrating students' home languages into everyday instruction, including translanguaging techniques. And in the final tag, they were guided in identifying their professional learning needs and create an action plan for a sustained future development in multilingual teaching beyond the project time. We collected data throughout the project. We interviewed teachers before the intervention to understand their experiences and professional learning needs. And during the project, we observed and recorded all teacher activity group meetings and collected reflective journals as well. And finally, we interviewed teachers again to explore what had changed in the life of the project. This allowed us to examine not only what teachers taught, but how their thinking and classroom practice, as they report us in the interviews, developed over the time. Before the project, teachers consistently described how language barriers affected learning. Many explained that linguistic minority students struggled to understand classroom instruction, needed repeated explanations, and participated less confidently. One teacher told us, "We often had to repeat instructions several times." These comments highlighted how strongly language shaped everyday classroom experiences for these students. I will keep the slide on for a little bit so that you can have a quick read for yourselves. Teachers also spoke about the practical challenges they faced. They described difficulties communicating with students, uncertainty when children used languages that they didn't understand, and frustration that many learners couldn't fully access classroom learning day to day. These experiences confirmed the need for professional development that goes beyond theory and equips teachers with practical multilingual strategies. With that background established, I will now hand over to my colleague Yum, who will share what happened after the teacher activity groups and what teachers learned through the project. Thank you.
So after the training, the English teacher then led their own text, and we had altogether 45 teachers participated in the project. We organized them into 15 tags, and each tag included one English teachers and two subject teachers, so that teachers from different subject areas could learn from each other. And during these sessions, they talked about the student language backgrounds, reflected on their classroom practices, and shared the challenges that they face in the classroom, as well as discussed the ways to use translanguaging in their classroom. And this structure supported a gradual progression from building awareness to taking action. And the tag met online for about an hour with the observation of a teacher educator. The English teacher also had a separate online mentoring meeting with a teacher educator after each tag meeting, so that they can share the obstacle that they encounter during the tag meetings as well as the progress. And this ongoing support was an important part of the project. And here is the tag cycle. Well, technically it has two main parts. First was the preparation phase, where they engage with the tag resource books. They need to do some kind of like background readings and watch the video, very short videos about translanguaging, as well as completed some classroom related tasks. Then the collaborative meeting, where they share with their colleagues their reflections and discuss the teaching experiences, as well as planned how to apply the new ideas in their teaching context. And here are a couple examples of the preparation activities that a teacher needs to complete it before the tag meetings. In this one, you can see that the teacher needs to read a short scenarios, and then they discuss whether the person in this scenario is a multilingual. And in this second activity here, they need to collect information about their student language backgrounds. For example, what languages they could use, how about how good they are in terms of speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Right, that is how we intervene in that period. And then for data collection, we collected data at 3 different phases of the project. For the first phase, before the intervention, we interviewed 15 English teachers and 15 other subject teachers in order to understand their beliefs as well as experiences with multilingual teaching. And as Melike already shared, they had some kind of needs in their teaching context. And during the intervention, we audio recorded all 60 tag meetings in order to collect, teacher reflective journals and field notes. We collected English teachers only because they are the leader of the group. And we also collected the teacher educator reflection notes in order to document the collaborative learning process. And after intervention, we interview again the same group of teachers in the pre-interview in order to see how their perspectives and teaching practices in the classroom change over time. And unfortunately, one ELT teacher, one English teacher, had to withdraw from the project because of the health issue. So we need to merge that tag with another one. Regarding the finding, first of all, we had seen some important impact in 3 main areas. First one is teacher learning. So we can see that teachers shifted their thinking from seeing or viewing multilingualism as a challenge to recognizing it as a valuable resource for learning. And many of them also reported that they did use multilingual strategies such as translanguaging and bilingual scaffolding in their classroom. And they also reported greater student engagement in the classroom and confidence. As one of them shared that previously, we required students to use only Vietnamese in the classroom. Through this project, we have shifted our mindset. Now we encourage students to use their own language in learning, and we respected their linguistic backgrounds. Second is the collaboration. So we see that the text creates opportunity for teachers from different subjects to reflect together. They exchange the ideas and solve classroom challenges collaboratively. And many teachers also reported that they felt less isolated and building stronger professional relationship. And the last one is the teacher leadership. English teacher gradually became more confident in leading discussion as well supporting their colleagues. However, this development varied across the groups. From the data collected and the findings, we had made some recommendation for teachers, teacher educators, and policy makers. For example, teacher, it is important to view student home languages as a valuable resource rather than barriers. So we can see that tech can also provide a very supportive space for teachers to reflect on their practice, to try out multilingual strategies as well as to build the confidence, especially among teachers from the ethnic minority groups. And for teacher educator, it is important to provide continuous support rather than isolated training sessions. They can also encourage teachers to collaborate across the subject areas and help them to adapt multilingual strategies in their teaching contexts. And as for the policymakers, so we think that it is important to have clear guidance on multilingual education and with a stronger support for professional learning communities, as well as it is important to recognize and to invest in minority teachers because they can help to promote the more inclusive multilingual classrooms. So overall, our findings suggest that the meaningful supports required at every level, like from individual teachers, teacher educators, and policymakers. And that's also the end of our presentation. Thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you for sharing these very useful and interesting highlights from your research. So I'd like to ask a couple of questions. Firstly, you mentioned that multilingualism is about using home language, but there's also a question in the Q&A. I wonder if use a language means speak it or understand it, think about it, read it, write it. So what was the focus of multilingualism in this context?
I think I can have a go at this question, and then Yum, please feel free to step in to complete as you wish. So the literature about that previously was quite strict. Being able to call yourself a speaker of a language or user of a language, you were expected to have certain proficiency across skills. However, there have been lots of critiques of that. First of all, because we are not equally able. How do you justify this homogeneous language use for a disabled person, for example, who cannot hear or speak? And also another criticism was that some languages are never written, they're only spoken, or some languages are only written, like Latin, and they're not spoken. With this criticism over time, plus the ideas of inclusion, currently the literature adopts much more fluid definition of multilingualism, bilingualism. So it is much more open and it doesn't specify proficiency. So if one person can use language meaningfully, even though they are not very proficient, even though maybe they can only speak and cannot write, but they can be considered multilingual because it is within their repertoire. They can get things done with this language. I hope this helps, and this is how we adopted multilingualism definition in this project as well.
Thank you for clarifying. And also, you mentioned teachers working together in the teacher activity groups. So these teachers include both English teachers and subject teachers. The question is also, what about teachers of other languages? Were they included?
I can again give it a go, but I will certainly pass it over to Yon because she's much more familiar with the participants. We didn't specify any subject group. Certainly, the most specific group for us were English language teachers because we wanted to develop them as leaders. However, the other subject teachers could be from any, including other foreign language teachers, but I'm passing over you to give a more specific answer on that.
So in our teaching context, many teachers prioritize the use of Vietnamese, even though a lot of students, when they start with the U1, for example, they can use a little bit of Vietnamese. They cannot speak or write, for example. Some of them do not know Vietnamese at all. So teachers were encouraged to use and learn their own languages as well, the ethnic language as well. And many of the teachers in our group, they are from ethnic groups, so they can use other languages rather than just Vietnamese. But because they, at the beginning of the project, they didn't know that they need to use different languages as a very beautiful or valuable resource in the language teaching in the classroom, but they only prioritize Vietnamese. So that's the point, and we introduced to them the importance of using different languages in learning in order to support the learning. Yeah.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you so much. And so how can collaboration be successful with a multilingual, varied level group? So this was perhaps what you discussed, what teachers discussed in these teacher activity groups, right? So how to actually make it happen. And so would you like to tell us more about the teacher activity groups? You told us briefly the structure. What did they discuss? What activities did they do? And it took for 8 weeks. So is there any evidence that these tasks continued, or what would make them self-sustaining without external facilitation in the long term? Because I believe these were very successful and efficient for teacher learning.
Yeah, so as we already shared that before the tech meetings, they had to do some kind of reading and watching video. It can be done individually, and some of them did actually meet each other at school because they were teaching at the same school. So they met each other at the break time to discuss and to work together with the tech materials. Then they had the meeting together, they discussed. And during those tech meetings, the teacher educator also attend in order to help them. For the first meeting, we joined in very actively to help them to guide the meeting. But then for the next several meetings, we withdraw our roles a little bit. We just observe how they work to see how the English teacher can guide the discussion in the group. And after that meeting, then the English teacher met the teacher educator to discuss the progress, any problems, for example. And we can see that from the first meeting, the teachers start to, collect information about the student background, for example, because in the same class, we have not just Vietnamese students, we have different ethnic groups, for example. So the teacher needs to know the students from different language backgrounds, what are the subjects or what are the languages they could use in the classroom. And in the second sections, then they discuss with each other the multilingual, what does it mean, for example, and how we use, different teaching strategy, multilingual strategies, for example. So teachers are very engaged in those activities. For example, those subject teachers, they ask us, like, they had difficulty with teaching students in the classroom because at U1 and U2, some of them are not good at, Vietnamese at all, and they are very shy in the classroom. So when the teacher asks them to answer questions, they often just smile or keep silent. But when a teacher encouraged them to use their own language in the group for discussion or do some stuff together, then they feel more confident to use their own language for collaboration in the classroom. And then the next tag meeting, we start to ask them to plan how to, continue with professional development. And in the interview, they share with us that they hope that this project continues so that they can work together. And I did contact with some of them after the project, and they shared that they still keep the same group and discussing because we have the same Zalo group in our discussion. Yeah.
That's great to hear. Thank you so much. So we will continue with our questions and Q&A, and after our second group of presenters. So thank you so much, Melike and Thi Phuong, and then we will have you again at the end of the session for the final Q&A. Thank you once again, and please, colleagues, keep posting your questions in the Q&A. We'll have a final Q&A. And yes, now I'd like to invite Tae-Hee and Prem to continue with the second part of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Serene. So it is really a great honor and pleasure to meet you. So we were talking about the question. I mean, we were researching, focusing our project on the question that was raised from the floor just now, which is how you try to integrate multiple languages when the teacher doesn't have the command of it, and how, like, the workings of how was like the focus of our project. So we will start to share this. So we were trying to also work with the teacher leaders so that this change of integrating ethnic languages into the classroom can be sustained. The details will be explained by Dr. Poudel. And so the context, as you can see, it was in Nepal, where we have multiple languages as to be discussed. Even though everyone here, I assume that you already think that integrating multilingualism into classroom is beneficial. That's why you are here. But still, we will briefly check why again, and then what are some of the challenges, and why translanguaging, one specific way of doing multilingualism, is great. And then what we learned from the case of Nepal, what specific challenges were addressed and how. Then we will briefly present the transitional model summarized in 3 different aspects, and then the lessons for teacher educators will be shared. So why do we try to integrate mother tongues, even if everybody thinks that the official language, like Nepalese for the Nepal case, and English, which is the currency everywhere. So even parents and students want these 2 languages rather than mother tongue. It is because it has like multiple benefits. It helps students to cognitively engage and develop their knowledge better and in a deeper way than when they try to build a language in 2nd and 3rd languages. It helps build the stronger rapport, and then also helps students to be more engaged emotionally, which is set to help students to retain the language longer. And it also fights the linguistic hierarchies, especially when the ethnic language is used by only very few. The language goes further down the hierarchy, and the users, like from our project, we could see that they were ashamed of that background, and they didn't even want to reveal their ethnic background or linguistic background. So using the multiple ethnic languages that are present in the classroom, all of them, that is also related to students' confidence and then pride in their own background, and fight stigmatization. And finally, it is really a human rights matter, and also, like, it is not just language, but the cultural heritage that is represented by the language is also being respected. Therefore, we try to do this very challenging job. And also, nowadays, many international organizations and transnational governments are trying to integrate multilingualism. And therefore, that's why we are investigating and then investing into this issue. What are typical issues when you're trying to integrate mother tongues into the classroom when there are especially like multiple languages? Obviously, like from students and parents' point of view, they feel that this time used spending mother tongues will suppress the time, like decrease the time that they can use in developing the key languages for mobility, such as Nepalese and English. And also when the one part, so in the typical practice is that the schools would, even though they use mother tongues in the official curriculum, they can only choose one or two, and therefore all the other languages can be excluded. And even if the teacher tries to integrate multiple languages in the classroom, when one particular language is used, the other students, especially if they don't have a peer who shares the mother tongue, would feel excluded. And obviously teachers worry that they can't control the classroom and they don't know what is going on. And assessment is usually done in certain key languages, such as the national language or English, if it is an EMI school, which is becoming ever popular around the world. So we are saying translanguaging can be one solution to adopt multilingualism. So as just mentioned by the previous presenters, these days, multilingualism doesn't mean that you have to have the full capacity to use any languages that are brought into the classroom. But even if you can just say yes or no, just bring in one word of your mother tongue background into the classroom, or you can just respond to it. We will bring in the model, how you can integrate the language, but we have to remember that it is not a prerequisite to have the full capacity and understanding of all the languages in classroom. So that is the concept of translanguaging. Pedagogic translanguaging means that rather than just leaving the choice of languages to the users, the teachers take the initiative and plan the usage very clearly and strategically, so that every language that is in classroom or represented by the users of the language, in our case, the students, can be given equal chance for them to share their language, and then each of them get attention from each of the classroom members, so that the others can understand what the language is like sounds like, and what kind of cultural knowledge it brings into the classroom. So I will now invite Dr. Poudel to explain what kind of things we have done through the project and what the context is like. So could you please,
Thank you.
Dr. Prem?
Thank you, Tae. Yeah, continuing on what I mentioned before, that Nepal is a multilingual country having more than 124 languages, and most of the languages there are dying. The other context there is that the schooling system promotes two of the languages, English and Nepali, while all other languages, which are the ethnic and local languages, are languages of the minority groups, they have not been brought into the school system. So this practical, challenge is one of the, pertinent, concerns that English teaching should be located within. But at the same time, as a part of the democratic movement and the political change in Nepal, the recent policy processes and policy infrastructure, they have allowed the use of minority language as the medium of instruction in school. However, that has not been the practice yet. So I don't know why they are not moving. Tae, can you move? Because I cannot move the slides. Multilingualism, or multilingual process could be one of the ways to go ahead as a process of empowering teachers. And this project, as also mentioned by Tae in the background, that this project on translanguaging pedagogy was able to bring some changes at the institutional and individual level, where through the translanguaging engagement, students were more motivated to learn. They started reaching out to the community. they were, they were not expert. They were trying to understand the language matter from community and cultural perspective. So that was one change that we found. The others is a kind of sustainability issue, which was raised before, has been strengthened because previously most of the changes were project based and kind of one off, but this time we have, been able to trace that teachers have started promoting their own pedagogy in a more linguistically just process and just ways, and they have adopted some multilingual pedagogical skills by themselves, and they have created something new as well. So this is another benefit that we could see. The other thing is on inclusive, classroom engagement of students, because those students who were remaining back, silent and were passive, they also could actively participate in the multilingual activities while learning English. So English learning was more effective than before because students' participation was more inclusive and they were highly engaged in the activities that the teachers conducted. And also the teachers and the students also, they have reported that there is an improvement in their understanding of the content. So the curricular contents, for example, science contents and mathematics contents, they were very much, and they were learned better than before, and they were trying to connect these contents with the languages and culture. So in this participatory engagement the study that we conducted in Nepal, we could notice, we could trace that there was a kind of awareness level developed across teachers. So teachers could see the value of integrating home languages and other languages, right? So before that, most of the schools were either English medium and Nepali medium. So teachers were more aligned either to Nepali or English. But during the project period, we could see that teachers improved their understanding and awareness of the value of home languages in the classroom. And they found that their activities, which were translanguaging, were more impactful than before. And there was also another change in their attitude because they prefer to use one language at a time, but this time we could see that they were happy enough to encourage other teachers as well to use other languages in their classroom. So teachers also, as this is a participative study, teachers develop their skills in co-creating lesson plans. So we work together with teachers in carrying out the classroom activities, at the same time designing lesson plans and so on. So at the practice and understanding level, there are a lot of change going on in the school processes. So that's why we mentioned before that there was a change in the agency of students as well as teachers, and we could see some sustainability issues, concerns, and they were promoting this multilingual pedagogy and translanguaging process in the school. It developed inclusion and also improved the understanding of students' content understanding. So I would like to request Tae-Hee to continue on this translanguaging outcomes.
Thank you, Dr. Poudel. So I will explain what we did, but I think maybe it is a good idea for me to share the activity outcome here. So you can see that the students, these are all student activity outcome. And one of the questions, I was reading the questions while Dr. Poudel was presenting, and then one of the teachers was, the audience was saying, so how do you do that? Like, are you talking about teachers' use of the like a mother tongue or students' usage of it? So actually, we're talking about the both teachers and students' usage of mother tongue. But obviously, the teachers, they can only integrate the ones they are fluent with. So in some schools, there were like a dominant minority languages such as Tamang or Bhojpuri, etc. Whereas in other schools, there were like 20 languages in one classroom. So it really depends on the classroom situation, whether the teachers can actually use it because obviously, if the teacher uses only one particular mother tongue, that is exclusive, as one of you also pointed out. So we are focusing on students' usage in case there are multiple. But the teachers could be a learner of different languages, like even just one word, like a number words, like depending on the class. So one of you were asking, how can we encourage that when the students are really little? You can do that by showing, being a model. So if the teacher is willing to learn, for instance, like a number 1, 2, 3 in all of the ethnic languages that are present, the other students would be more willing, and then they will be really, really happy. When I was in Nepal, when I learned some words such as like a swing, like lingapang, they really were very happy. So I can see the power of just learning one vocabulary even. So here you can see some of them were like the activities were like in one activity they were asked to use multiple languages, or different groups of students were using different languages. And if the student is fluent, you can use them, ask them to fully translate the whole. Otherwise, you can just ask them to use vocabulary only. And it can be done by one student, or it can be done by multiple students. You can see we did this with the science, math, and English teachers. So now I will give the full models that we have developed in integrating translanguaging into classroom. So the 3 ways one is using the activities, because after all, we are talking about usage of language rather than receptive understanding. So what we did was we were creating a repertoire of activities that will help students to integrate the language. So here are some of it. And if we look at the Q&A, not Q&A, the chat room, the British Council has already shared a link to our handbook. It has all of the activities, examples across subjects like English, math, and science. So here are only a few. We, for instance, asked the students to engage with the content with creating chants or rhymes or songs. If you're teaching girls, I'm not trying to be gender biased, but in Nepal context, the boys didn't really like singing, but they were happy to do rhyming or chanting. So which is why we did this. So for instance, like the periodic tables for science, they have to memorize all these things. And then if they were creating chants, making it to the content knowledge into the chants that they already know very well, they really liked it. So you could do it like one language, the next language, this way, or just key vocabulary in mother tongue. You can integrate it different ways. I will explain in the next slide. Also, you can do mnemonics. I think everybody knows the solar system. So you can see the example, like my very educated mother just served. This is like the Mars and Earth, like the planets. I forgot. So that's like how you do it, like the mnemonics. And then creating poster, you saw some of the examples. And then also the students were asked to do a role play or short drama, for instance. And then you can integrate the languages in very many ways, as you can see in this next slide. So how to mix languages? Both students and teachers were worried because, as one of the presenters in the previous presentation pointed out, some students have the command of language in full, like the mother tongue. Others only can understand when they hear, or they only know very few vocabulary, like words. So what we asked, we explained both to students and teachers that you don't have to do the full translation. Translanguaging means you use whatever you have. So within a sentence, they could put in the mother tongue that they know, because using the language will like excite the schemata of the whole knowledge system that they have built around the mother tongue. So using just a single word is very helpful if it is a keyword. For instance, like the water cycle, evaporation, or crystallization. That kind of word, if they know in their mother tongue, that will help students to like bring up their knowledge that they built in their own language. And across groups, so you don't have to worry that everybody has to use all languages at one go. You can ask that each of the language group to get together and then build poster, etc. together, or you can ask different language groups to stay together in one group, and then you saw that like a different multiple language, like a translation of the key sentence in the first example. So we could do that as well. Or we can use, it doesn't have to be the verbal or written language. We can also use other pictures, realia, gestures, etc. to help communicate. And then it can be across persons. When you are asking students to do the individual work, then it can be across students. Then everybody can engage with their own language. It can be across lessons. Many teachers said it really creates a lot of follow-up, because translation, etc. So they couldn't do it every day. I totally agree with that. So you don't have to do it every day, or so you can do it once a week or once a month, and then across the lessons that you are doing multilingualism, you can designate the languages that you will use in that classroom. If there are 20 around the year, you can designate one particular language like every other week. Then every language can be given the space. Why do we do this? Because it is like a language learning is not simply language, as I explained at the very beginning. It is also about the dignity, pride, and then understanding the variety and diversity and respecting others. So giving this official space makes that particular language, especially when it is really a small minority language, make it official and then be happy. I really understand this key importance, because my daughter, as a Korean language user, nobody used it, so she was so shy. When the teacher brought the language into the classroom, that changed the whole thing, and she was no longer ashamed of her background. And finally, across time within the day, you don't have to force students to use the language within the classroom. Say that you can do it after class. Like you can just write in whatever language you feel comfortable. Then you can change the keywords after you go home, and then do the research. But what are some of the resources? Because not everyone knows the language fully, as I said, right? So the students can use like the peers as resources. They can ask each other, obviously, dictionaries and language learning materials, but family and relatives. And we were so happy that some of the students went out of the way and then asked the community members, and then they started to learn the language. And obviously, online sources these days, ChatGPT and many others, can be very helpful. So I think I have said enough, and I will give the floor to Dr. Poudel now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Choi, for the elaboration. So, as mentioned before, that translanguaging was very much useful for promoting inclusion in the classroom, and the exclusionary practices in terms of language, culture, and even gender were minimized. So that means that this project brought the diverse learning experience of the students, and they promoted their agency towards learning English and towards promoting their content learning experiences. Along with this, I don't know why this is not moving. Okay, so we have also said that I think this repeats what we said before. So this translanguaging pedagogy in a way promoted social inclusion and equity, because Nepal's diversity and so on and linguistic, complex in the classroom always awaited for change, and that change was in relation to the inclusion and equity in learning. So that's why at the equity and inclusion level, there were some changes. Students had access to learning, and they also promoted their learning outcomes. They improved learnings and so on. So, hello. So finally, we would like to draw on our implications to teacher education process, where so what we need to know is we need to educate teachers, we need to develop teachers' capacity, and we need to empower teachers to integrate multiple languages in their classroom. So there is no problem in using English, but effective teaching of English will promote their better learning experiences. So that's why bringing together multiple language in the classroom as the classroom context demands would be very much useful for children to promote their learning. So teachers and teacher educators should understand how to integrate multiple languages in the same classroom while teaching English or other subjects. So if teacher educators and the future teachers, for example, those who are in the pre-service teacher education, if they are empowered today, they will make impactful learning conditions. They will create learning conditions for children and so on. So they will influence the pedagogy, they will influence the curricula and so on. So as we conducted this study from a participatory action research, we also learned that collaboration and co-working experiences make more engaging and meaningful learning. And teachers were reflecting their practices, and they said that they are learning from their reflections and everyday experiences and so on. So though our teacher education programs are highly monolingual in a way, or one language focused or two language focused, in the context of Nepal, I think that also applies to global community where multilingual social context exists, that teacher education programs should be reoriented towards adopting translanguaging. There are some concerns about, if you use translanguaging as a pedagogy, English proficiency will be, hampered or will be affected negatively, and some misconceptions there. So that's why through teacher education programs, we thought that the translanguaging pedagogy can be advanced, and that will help, improve the learning outcomes of students, and that will ultimately support the UN goal of sustainable development, UN Sustainable Development Goal about quality of education. So considering the time, we'll be very quick, and we'll be taking your questions for further discussion of the topic. Moving. Tae-Hee, can you move it?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tae-Hee, you have anything to say?
Maybe we can just listen to the
Okay.
questions, but just wanted to say that we have this ELTRA project website. So if you type like this and then maybe my name, Tae-Hee Choi, then you can see this project website. So you have all the photos, materials there as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, we have received so many questions and so many great comments as well. Thank you for this very clear description of the multilingualism in the classroom. So your examples were really very helpful. So for us to continue, well, how do we build confidence among minority teachers? So this confidence building was part of also your action research, participatory action research. You also mentioned that. Would you like to tell us about any strategies that you used?
I'll go first, and then Prem, you can. So what we found is that the teachers, so we did regular online meeting monthly, and then Dr. Prem visited the schools every week, and then because we had several schools, like about one every month, he had like a personal interaction, and then also the other collaborators there. So what we found is that initially they said they are confident, they like the pedagogy, etc. But when we really like talked about it, we could sense that there is ambivalence, and then they were actually like saying, yeah, this is good, but we have this problem, you know? So what we found is that doing really like a residential and then extended workshop, and then sharing the problems together, and also talking from the other parties. So rather than being the evangelizer of translanguaging, we were asking them to be the opponents. And then we were like bringing all these questions and problems, and then we discussed the solutions together one by one. And that way, I think that was really helpful. The second thing was, some of the teacher leaders, they were really great. They were tracing the changes, the standard test or like a midterm and final, and then the control group, and then the experimental group. What was the difference? And also they were bringing in all these anecdotes where students who were too shy to say anything in either Nepalese or English were really like outspoken after the mother tongue was integrated. So I'll stop here and Dr. Prem.
Yeah, thank you. I think you elaborated the concern, and what we could see is the confidence level improving across teachers as well as students. So the teachers who were hesitant to do that, or who are resisting, for example, they will say, "Oh, no, multilingual in science, perhaps not. You know, how can we translate the technical words in science and mathematics into Nepali or children language?" So that kind of agitation was there in the very beginning. But after the reflections and series of engagement in the workshops and so on, and finally, they were very much interested to create new words, coin new words, translate words, and they also involved students in doing so. And they found some of the students were bringing very interesting words from their languages to be used in the classroom content and understanding of the content. So it was a clear change in confidence, at the same time motivation in teachers to bring multiple languages, because they could find the changes in terms of learning. At the same time, some of the teachers also said that their job was more easier at that time, around the end of the project, than before, because they were using multiple languages and children were more engaged and so on. So we could see that. I think now we can further talk about this issue in another question, maybe, because it is connected. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying. And what methods do you recommend for assessing the effectiveness of multilingual teaching approaches? And connected to this, another question very similar: how can we evaluate a multilingual classroom with different strategies and techniques? So how can we assess the effectiveness of a multilingual classroom in your experience?
Dr. Poudel, you go first, and then I'll take up.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think this is an interesting question. Perhaps the question was about how to assess the effectiveness of multilingual pedagogy, right? Not students' learning outcomes, but what happens actually is, one thing is more quantified measurement, but the actual impact in the classroom, in children's learning, children's happiness, and then participation in the classroom processes. Those who were never speaking in the classroom started speaking, right? Teachers who were always using English or sometimes Nepali as the only language, they started using multiple languages, and children started learning this curricular content more effectively. And children's culture and linguistic, specific features, let's say cultural matters, contents came into the classroom. So another kind of dynamics was created in the classroom. I think that is something positive, and also aligns with the national, let's say, policies of promoting multilingualism, inclusion, and diversity. So I think as we saw these kind of improvements during the project period, I think multilingual pedagogy can be the effectiveness of multilingual pedagogy can be seen in children's learning engagement, teachers, activities, and designing of the materials, and inclusive learning environment created in the classroom. So we could see that. Tae, would you like to add?
Yeah, so I also read some of the questions related to that, like some of them were like mentioning a CFR, like a very beginning, EAL learners, like how, and then I think the answer to this question that Sirin brought in could be we should think of the effectiveness in consideration of where the learners are. So if the students are coming from zero, if they learn one or two words, that is great achievement because you can see like how to pronounce it or how to recognize the like a writing. Like when I first started the project, I didn't know which one was Nepali or which one was Bofri or Ojibri or but after a while I started to have this sight understanding of the characters, for instance. So I think like the effectiveness should be measured against where the students are starting and then where you want to go. And as Dr. Poudel rightly pointed out, we have to understand that the linguistic proficiency, it is not necessarily the performance, visible performance, but the perception of that and related self-identity. And also the other thread that Dr. Poudel mentioned is linking it to the policy. So Dr. Poudel is now advising the government in terms of teachers' competency framework because, like partly with these projects, like, popularity and then, the efficiency or impact. So I think pitching it to the existing policy is one way to persuade teachers and then other stakeholders of the values because it is not going against but for. And one other question related was, English medium schools, they are discouraging you to use other languages. But if they know the conceptualization, if they are more open to the conceptualization and then see the benefits, because after all, when the students want to learn or the parents want their children to learn English, it is because of the mobility. But if you only know the language and then have the proficiency, but you don't have the like a global awareness, inclusive attitude, etc., you're not going to survive or thrive. So I think persuading the key stakeholders is very important. So like what I did was myself, I was trying to communicate the needs and benefits to parents as well as the students repeatedly, because you can't just assume you say once and then they know and agree like a once and for all. It doesn't happen. So you have to give the message repeatedly across time and include multiple stakeholders that has the voice. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, this also answers another question. So how did the parents, local community react as this approach make them more involved in their children's education? So it's great to hear that as well. Yes, definitely. Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. And now I would like to invite Melike and Dung Cao as well to have a couple of more questions. So before we finalize our session. So first of all, the overall, well, there were so many great questions. I'm trying to understand the patterns, but yes, the understanding is that the teachers feel a little bit unprepared. Why do many teachers feel unprepared to teach learners from minority language backgrounds? And connected to that, again, you mentioned this building confidence and the role of teacher educators here. What are the biggest challenges here for teacher educators? So both projects speak to this, and I'd like maybe if you can, if both projects answer this briefly from your experience. Melike, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, confidence about languages. That's an interesting one, and we didn't come to understand it before the project. So when we were in the field, we realized that minority, the teachers who share the same minority languages with the students were uncertain about using their languages at school because there was a shared understanding that in school we speak Kin. This is the expectation. When they use their minority languages, they almost felt like they're doing something inappropriate, they're doing something that's not formal, it's quite informal, belongs to out of the school. That was interesting because when we looked at the language policy, and probably Yom will be able to provide more detail about that, there was an effort to be inclusive of the minority languages at the policy level, and actually most of the teachers were encouraged to get certificates on proficiencies on those minority languages, which gives us the hint that actually the government wants teachers to learn and use these languages at school. But at the school level, this wasn't perceived that way. At the school level, teachers were not feeling confident using these languages for learning and teaching purposes. That was very interesting. In our project, in the teacher activity groups, when teachers came together and questioned these things, and when this was supported by the reading that we offered to them, they started teaching, maybe that's fine to use our languages in our classroom. Maybe it's not informal or bad or unwanted. So they started questioning this. And one of the achievements of the project was agreeing that it's actually okay. I don't need to use it secretly or avoid it completely. And I think this is a big achievement. Some of them were like, I feel myself more valuable now because I can actually support my students using our language, shared language. That awareness, I think, was one of the biggest achievements of our project. Would you like to step in, Yum?
Yes, a little bit about the context here because the students, they are from year 1, year 2, year 3 at the primary level. So they're in the mountainous areas. So many of them can use their own ethnic languages. When they came to school, many of them could not use Vietnamese very fluently. So in the classroom, when the teacher used Vietnamese to teach, so they had difficulty with understanding and a lot of difficulty with communicating with the student because students can use different languages. And that's the point where the teacher felt like they were unprepared for teaching students of this group because in the classroom they speak different languages, and sometimes the students they sit in group, they communicated in their own languages, so the teacher don't understand what they're talking about at all. So yeah, that's what they shared, that they didn't know how to deal with those kind of situations. Sometimes they couldn't find words to explain themselves, so they have some problem with that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah.
And yes, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think our concerns are quite common, and then what you can see is at the teachers level and students level, the deficit mentality in relation to the minority languages has been minimized, because in the project period or in the beginning of the project period, people were saying that, oh, is it possible to learn in that language and something like that. So later they say, oh, this is quite useful and so on. So and students also who are hesitant to bring their language in the classroom by being shamed or something like that. So they started using the language very openly with confidence and so on. So I think a lot of micro level changes have been taking place, and that has improved their confidence as well as motivation in learning those languages. And they now know that there is no harm in using mother tongues or other local languages while learning English. I think this is one of the major departure we could see.
That's great. Yes, thank you. And would you like to share anything? Tae-Hee? Yes, you're on mute.
Yeah, so what I want you to add is that teachers' confidence, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are worried about their linguistic competence, but they are, like as Dr. Melike just points out, they are worried that the students are not on task. So what we have to do is using the role assignment. So even though they can use their mother tongue, when they are presenting and sharing, they have to share in the common language, whether it is Nepalese or whether it is English, so that the students are actually on task. Then the teachers at least know that is what they are doing. And also the teachers can also give the time difference, and also we are using each other as a resource. And one of the questions raised was like, what if the student doesn't know any language, any other language? But that feeling of like that means that usually they are the users of the majority language, like Nepalese, because they don't need to learn other like minor languages. In such case, experiencing that kind of like, embarrassment that not knowing the language will help them to be in the other people's shoes when they are the users of the minor languages. So we can think of the benefits from different aspects, and then we can use different mechanisms to ensure that the students are on task. And then obviously the central language, like to kind of keep the flow going, should be the common language. It is multilingualism, not exclusively one minority language that nobody else understands except for a couple of students.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So all of these are really very helpful. And yes, now one last question. What kind of pedagogy are teachers and teacher educators promoting for sustainability? So what are your final recommendations for teacher educators to make this pedagogy sustainable in the long term, or who would like to start such an initiative in their contexts? First, perhaps downloading your publications, right? So you have all this information and roadmaps written there. Yes, Melike, please go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, it is very important to recognize that in our project, and I can see in the other project as well, we like to imagine teachers as professionals who can make changes to their teaching informed with their contextual information. However, we sadly see in so many contexts that's not the case. Teachers centrally usually viewed as technicians who just apply the curriculum in practice. So we do recognize there isn't always a space for teachers to do things differently. However, we are trying to help out in small ways that this can be done. And therefore, we use tags, which we think as a grassroots change rather than a top-down change in teacher education. And we found translanguaging as a very useful concept in our project, because I can see there are lots of questions about teachers sharing the same languages with students. If you go and read more about translanguaging, you will get to realize that this doesn't require the teacher to know and share the languages with the students. It's all about making your classrooms inclusive spaces for all languages and making your classrooms as a fair place for all languages, not coming across as valuing one language over the other, and also encouraging the use of these languages. And even though if there are multilingual and monolingual students in your class, there is evidence of benefits of having multilingual pedagogies in a classroom on monolingual students, but there is no evidence of any disadvantage for the monolingual. So it is always beneficial for multilingual learners as well as the monolingual students in your classroom. So more awareness about translanguaging and hopefully more use of it across the world will be good for our languages and for our learners.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And I think it is really important to see the value of creating the network of the teachers and then teacher educators, because the issues will evolve. So once you tackle the issue of awareness raising, then the next step is, to do the developing the materials together with the teachers, reflecting the locality, and then putting that into the system. And the migration, all these social changes will bring in other issues, other languages, and therefore the nature of the issues will change. And therefore, we can't just give some materials and then think, that's it. So we have to keep the community of learning, which we started through our projects, and which will continuously answer the questions the new joiners will have, and then solve the problems together. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Is there anything else would you like to add, Prem, or Yung Cao?
No, I think all covered. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you to our presenters. You have shown us something that connects both journeys. So when teachers are trusted as leaders, as researchers of their own practice, real change follows. And also what stays me from today is this shift that you described. So from seeing learners' home languages as barrier, or maybe not seeing them as invisible constructs, to seeing them as resources. So that doesn't happen only through policy alone, but it happens through the kind of patient, collaborative work that your projects created. So the space that you created. Thank you so much once again for sharing your research with us. And I'd also like to thank our audience for your great questions. We hope you found the session useful and picked up some useful ideas to reflect on in your context. So just to, before we finalize the session, just a few reminders. The recording will be available on our Teaching English in the next couple of days, and the link to the certificate will be provided in the thank you email that you'll receive this week. And please share your feedback with us. You will see the feedback form in the chat, and don't forget to subscribe to our monthly newsletter for teacher educators. And finally, register for our next webinar, which is on how to use AI to support reflection and autonomy in teacher education in August. So we very much hope to see you all again in the future. And thank you, everyone. Thank you to our presenters once again for your valuable sharing. Bye, everyone.